Welcome into college football overtime. Day late, but not a dollar short. Got Abe Gordon here. Garrett Chapman right here. College football overtime. We got a lot to get into here on this show. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get going, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, make sure you keep up to date with all things college football. Because if you're watching this or listening to it, it's safe to say that you're kind of like us and you love college football. So make sure you are in the know. Drop a like, subscribe, do what you got to do so you get this content all off season long. But as we build up to a really exciting 2024 season, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And that actually gets us into one of the things we're talking about today, Abe. Who are the teams we are most excited about seeing in 2024 that could take a giant step forward? Plus, Kirby Smart made some comments, and we want to talk about them. But before we do all of that, here on this episode of College Football Overtime, Abe Gordon, like I do every week, man. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Garrett, man. We are counting down towards, spring games are on the way, and I know we're going to have that weird little spring transfer portal in a couple weeks we're going to have to break into, but it does finally feel like we're starting to get back into football season, which is always nice to chat about.
Yeah, absolutely. And Abe, I do want to start here because, look, a lot of teams had new coaches in 2023. A lot of programs had disappointing seasons in 2023. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a bad year in 2024. I think that there were a bunch of teams out there who are going to have a fantastic year who may not have had a great year by their standards or somebody else's the year before, right? Like you think about the Louisvilles, you think about Florida State, what they were able to do. You think of the way Colorado started with Deion Sanders out there on the West Coast, man. Like, sometimes teams go up, sometimes teams go down. It is a never-ending cycle here in this sport. Someone's got to win, right? But I do want to talk about those teams that could take that giant step forward in 2024 and potentially compete for a championship or maybe just get into a bowl game, make life hard for some of their opponents or maybe spoil something for another opponent. And Abe, we're just going to go through this step by step. And I'm going to start with a team and I'll let you jump onto a team. And if you agree with something I'm saying, then add on to it. If you disagree, tell me. All right. But the first team I do want to jump onto, Syracuse, a team that I think made a fantastic new head coach hiring with Fran Brown from the University of Georgia, the secondary coach down there in Athens. He goes up there and immediately brings some high profile recruits up there, at least for a visit, getting them in the door. That's generally step one, getting your staff familiarized with how to deal with higher profile recruits, maybe bring them in there. Maybe you get a commitment. Maybe you get that guy in there that can change your program. Well, they did that with the transfer portal, and they did that when they brought in a guy named Kyle McCord, a guy who I think could really do some big things up there at Syracuse in a mediocre ACC conference. And on top of that, Abe, I'm looking at their schedule. They're out of conference. They have Holy Cross. They got UNLV. They got Ohio. They got UConn. If you don't go 4-0 against that schedule, that's kind of a brutal way, a brutal type of start for Fran Brown up there at Syracuse. I fully expect him to win all four of those games. But then you go to the ACC schedule. You don't have a Clemson. There is no Florida State. I mean, the best team that you probably have on your schedule is Miami, and you have them at home. Other than that, it's Stanford, it's Georgia Tech, it's NC State, it's Pitt, it's VT, Boston College, Cal. I think you can win a lot of those football games, Abe. And honestly, I compared one of the teams, Louisville was a team that I looked at last year who was a team that could jump up and win 10 games. That was one of the teams on my list last year. They had a new head coach in Jeff Brom. They had a new quarterback in Jack Plummer, a guy who transferred in from the West Coast. I think ultimately this is a team who could really take a giant step forward in 2024.
Yeah, I got 4 teams on my list. I know you said you had 5. And Syracuse is one of them. I'm in 100% agreement with you. I will say this from a couple of aspects. It does feel like this is probably the largest group of highly talented players that Syracuse has had in a while. And most of that took place through the transfer portal or after Fran Brown took that job. My one concern, which is why I would slow play this in terms of the Qs, is we don't know if Fran Brown can coach. We don't know if his coordinators are any good, stuff like that. And so there are those discussions of, great, we've seen teams that have good players, quality players, not get it done on the field for one reason or another. So there are some questions as well. It's not just an afterthought that, yes, they're going to have success. But I do agree with you. Like this just feels like a collection of talent that they haven't had there at the Carrier Dome in a long, long time. So I do think, and I hadn't even looked at the schedule. I'm not going to play around with who they're facing and if those teams are any good, stuff like that. But I do agree with you. I mean, that's just another reason. But I had Syracuse on my list. The energy that Fran Brown has brought into that program has been outstanding. We saw them take some real big jumps in the transfer portal in their first window. Now let's see if they take some in the spring transfer portal as well, if they can get even more talent. But I tend to agree with you, man. This feels like a crazy influx of talent since he took over. And let's see how quickly it develops into success on the field.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you look at this class that's coming up in April. We don't fully know who's going to be in this transfer portal, but we have the spring games that are going to come, and we're going to get a better idea. But based off of some of the things that I've been hearing over there at 24/7 Sports, it could be a pretty wild spring, and it could be one of those things that it's the Band-Aid coming off, if you will, because of course you have this you have the court motions that say the NCAA can't prevent you from having multiple transfers. Well, here we go. We're about to jump into it, and we're going to see what happens. It might get a little uncomfortable here on maybe not on this podcast, of course not, but maybe in the college football world. Who's going to be on your roster? It's hard to know, really. But the month of April, I think we're going to learn a whole hell of a lot. But another team, I'm going to keep it in the ACC. It is the University of Miami. Mario Cristobal, you better take that step forward. 7 wins in 2023. That's just not going to be enough to get it done. That's not what he was hired to do. I think 10 wins could legitimately be in reach. You look at the schedule again. Florida State's coming in at home. You don't have Clemson. That's a big deal. And statistically, this offense and this defense have both taken steps forward both years that Mario Cristobal has been the head coach over there, down there in Miami. But they also go out in the transfer portal and they add a Cam Ward from Wazoo. And I think that when you add a guy like that, you add that level of athleticism for what was lacking with Tyler Van Dyke, who I think is going to come up here in just a little bit. I have him for another one of my teams. But look, Cam Ward offers a little something that fits this offense a little bit better, a little bit of playmaking ability. We talked about it last week on this podcast. He elevates your unit, and I think his ability to bust out of the pocket and make plays with his legs and just with his pure athleticism makes Miami a very interesting team. Miami, FanDuel has them as a 9.5 point or 9.5 a win team. I think they could eat that. I think they could jump on 10 wins. I think it's in reach.
Yeah, interesting. I like Miami. I'm not even sold on Cam Ward. Like I have questions about why he was so highly regarded. I know he got off to a great start on the West Coast, but it really fell off. And so I think he's got a lot to prove as well. For my next team, and I didn't know we're going to do this many ACC teams, but
that's my last ACC team, I promise.
Okay, I'm surprised you don't have this squad on there just for the same, but I think it's Georgia Tech for a number of reasons. Traditionally, we've talked about the jumps a program can make in a coach's second year, and I know Brent Key did have a little bit of interim time there, but we're really approaching the second year with this being his team. And quite frankly, it's as simple as I think they have one of the most talented quarterbacks all around in the entire country in Haynes King. He's an outstanding playmaker that took a step forward last year. Let's see if in the second year of this offense, with a year of confidence and as a starter and development under his belt, he possibly gets even better somehow. I mean, if that's the case, he might be one of the 5 or 6 best quarterbacks in the entire country. Look, I don't know what the upper limits of Georgia Tech are. I'm not going to go crazy. Like, is this a team that can be what Florida State is? That's 12-0 or 11-1. I don't want to thrust that on them. I don't think, but we're talking about a team that was happy to be bowl eligible a year ago. I think there's more in store for Georgia Tech than just being happy to be bowl eligible this year. You talk about finding that 9-win number. I think realistically that would be what I'm shooting for. And I know they got tough non-conference games as well. That's always going to be part of it. But Look, if they can take that step forward in a second year of a head coach with a quarterback that I think is as talented. Look, a lot of times at Georgia Tech, you've stepped onto the field and your quarterback is inferior, and that puts you at a massive disadvantage. I don't know how often that's going to be the case this year, and I think that's a huge boon for the Georgia Tech program. Again, a lot of the teams that I have were not disasters a year ago. Georgia Tech certainly was not a disaster a year ago, but man, I think with the potential for them to be this year, I think they can ruin some seasons, and I look forward to that.
I love that pick. I love that. I mean, look, I cover the Jackets for 24/7 Sports. I mean, I'm pretty intimate and familiar with the program, and Haynes King is everything that is advertised. He is as good as anybody could have possibly said. He's finally living up to that 4-star billing that he got coming out of high school in Texas. And I completely agree with just about everything you said, ultimately, because that offense is going to be very good. I think with Chris Winkie and company, man, I think he is developing that quarterback room. And then Buster Faulkner calling the plays. I think that group is going to be a lot of fun. Eric Singleton is debatably one of the best young wide receivers in the ACC this upcoming year. He's going to be good. They run the ball really effectively, and that really came along later in the season. My only problem with the pick, just in particular, is the schedule. And
I told you I wasn't looking at the schedules yet.
I know. Like, I think Georgia Tech is going to be one of those deceptively good teams that they could win 6 games next year and be considered a much better football team than 6 wins. Their months of October and November, it's brutal. I mean, you have Louisville at the end of September, right? And then you have a bye week. Duke, you're on the road at North Carolina, a team that you generally play pretty well, but they're going to get up to come play you because you've beaten them so many years in a row. Then you have Notre Dame at home. You're on the road at Virginia Tech. That's a very difficult place to play up there at Blacksburg. Then you have Miami back here at home, who's going to have something to prove after the way you beat them last year. Then you have NC State at home, which they're always a really strong program. Come hell or high water, they're going to get to their 8 wins. And then you're on the road at Georgia. That is a brutal finish to the schedule.
Yeah, I'll be honest though, like you can read that off to me, and I'm like, boy, the only 2 games I'd be surprised that they win would be Notre Dame and Georgia. Like I don't know, like Duke, Carolina, like even Miami. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying they're going to be easy wins or anything like that, but like those don't jump out at me as games that Georgia Tech can't win. Notre Dame maybe, but we got to see what they are, and certainly Georgia, I understand, but like, yeah, it's a tough run, but it's not nightmarish.
Well, my point is not that one team is definitively better than the other. That's not really the point I was making necessarily. Georgia, Notre Dame are definitively better teams, but you also start the season with Florida State. You have to go on the road.
What are they going to be though? I don't know. Florida State doesn't scare me.
Florida State doesn't really scare me all that much. I think that's a game that you might be able to jump on some people, and surprise.
It's in Ireland.
It's in Ireland. So honestly, you never know, because then you come back home and play Georgia State, a game that you should win against Georgia State, a team that's shown that is fully capable of swimming with the big fish and jumping on somebody. But look, it's not that it's a murder's row. It's just that consistently these are a bunch of games where it comes in as like, ooh, that's going to be a good game. And that's just
it's also a string of games where you have to bring it. There's not a game where you're going to win if you don't have your best that day. And so from that perspective, like, you have to stay consistent for 7 weeks or 8 weeks. I understand it from that angle as well.
Yeah. And that's really the angle that I'm coming from. It's like, I would not be surprised if they come through that and come out with a winning record. I also would not be surprised if they come out with a losing record. And it's just the nature of football, and sometimes the ball bounces the opposite way, but there's no game in there that it's like, okay, that's a win. And that's what worries me about the schedule for Georgia Tech this year. But otherwise, I love the pick. I think it's a great one. I think Georgia Tech could be a really good team. I hope so, because that means my readers are going to be reading, and that's going to be good for me. But plus, it's good, it gives us something to talk about here in Atlanta too, with college football, with a program not named Georgia. But Abe, I'm going to move on to another one. I'm going to go up to the Big Ten, and these are 2 teams. I'm kind of going to lump these 2 together because they really fit that same kind of mold, for better or for worse. I mean, it's Nebraska and it's Wisconsin, right? Nebraska's got an over under win total of 7.5. Wisconsin sitting at about 6.5. Both have really, really well-respected head coaches entering their second year. Both added new quarterbacks, new guys who they expect to take the reins of their program. Tyler Van Dyke, obviously a graduate transfer, and he's only going to be here for a short period of time, obviously. Dylan Raiola, a little bit different up there. Number one overall player by a lot of metrics. Five-star quarterback. He's going to be electric, a lot of fun to watch. But both of these guys, head coaches specifically, are referred to as program builders. Maybe we don't see that step forward, but these two teams are going to be on this list for the next couple of years until they reach that level. Because I don't know about you, but I'm extremely confident that both of these teams, with these head coaches in place, are at least going to get to that 8-9 win threshold where they are consistently a strong program that you don't want to play on any given Saturday because they can jump on you. And ultimately, it's like I look at Wisconsin specifically. I see Phil Longo, the offensive coordinator. I think his play style works perfectly for what Tyler Van Dyke is going to come in and do. He transfers away from Miami, a place that ultimately didn't end up working out too well. But the guy likes to sling the rock. And the dude's got a lot of arm talent. He just dealt with a lot of injuries and a pocket that would collapse on him a little too quickly. I don't know if he's going to have to deal with that up at Wisconsin. With Phil Longo's air raid attack, I think that's going to be a pretty dynamic pairing, and it could really explode if Tyler Van Dyke can stay healthy. And then in Nebraska, Dylan Raiola speaks for itself. He has a lot of pressure on him to really take that program back to the promised land, back to the place that it once was. But he has all the talent to do that. And I think having a guy like Matt Rule in place at head coach, I think that means good things for that program. And it goes for both ones.
Yeah, quite frankly, I disagree strongly on both accounts, and we'll see how it plays out. One of us will be right, one of us will be wrong.
Sure.
And honestly, it has nothing to do with the teams. And you're right. I think they have taken both major upgrades at quarterback. I think it's a nightmare to go from irrelevant to contender in that conference. Maybe even more so than it would be in the SEC right now. I just think when you're adding in programs that you're unfamiliar with, in terms of Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, to the powers that already are Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, and seemingly somehow Iowa. I just think you're finding 9 and 10 wins very, very difficult on a given year. It's just there's so many and look, maybe over the course of a process they can reach that level. I just think there's too many games, and I told you I didn't look at the schedule, so maybe they luck out and they just don't happen. Maybe they get Indiana and Illinois and Michigan State a bunch, but I just think it's so often that they're going to step on the field being very clearly an inferior team in 2024 because of how good Oregon and USC and Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State. It's just going to be very tough, even at your best, to win those games. It's just incredibly difficult. Look, I don't have any SEC teams. I don't have any Big Ten teams in this discussion. I think there's too big of a jump from a teams where you got 5 or 6 teams that are going to be in the top 12, top 15 to where you could really make an impact in that manner. So, call me a coward for not taking that brave leap that you did. I just think it's really, really difficult to take that sort of a jump. When I think too often you're not going to be competitive enough or close enough to the team you're facing. But hey, I could be wrong and you could be right. I agree with you from a lot of angles here. I just don't know if it happens this immediately. But look, Van Dyke and Dylan Raiola are massive steps up. I think it is a huge change for Tyler Van Dyke that will fit him very well. I totally agree with you. I just think man for man, it's going to be so difficult to go up against some of the big boys that are now in that conference.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately the biggest thing that's going to hold both of those programs back in particular. You're right about that. I agree. I completely agree with where you're coming from there. But it also wouldn't surprise me if like a Nebraska or Wisconsin jumps on a team like a USC and pops them in the mouth and it just like gets them a welcome to the Big Ten sort of moment, and it's like, I don't think that Washington's necessarily going to come in and be a world beater of a team, at least not in year one.
Washington is not. Oregon and USC.
Oregon is. I think Oregon's going to be exceptionally good. UCLA is not going to be all that good. I think Michigan's going to take a pretty sizable step back.
Yeah.
I mean, I think potentially you're overrating some of that a little bit. That's just my opinion. I think once you get in you elevate the quarterback play as much as they are, I think that's a big deal. All right. So ultimately, this may not be even, and that's kind of how I preface my comments as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're program builders, and I think they're going to take a massive step forward. I think just because you get those signal callers in place, but it may not completely and totally show up on the win-loss record per se. But they're going to be a much more respectable opponent in 2024. They're going to be a team who's going to be in a lot more football games in 2024, and a lot of that comes back to the quarterback, and maybe that ends up bringing in more talent for the next couple of years. Program builders at head coach, and I think both of those guys, I have a lot of faith in what those guys can do in these teams, and ultimately it may not all show up on the field in 2024, but I think come 2025 they're going to be better off for it.
All right, Garrett, I got two more teams. Let's start with one that's also got a new coach that maybe you're not thinking of, probably because it's got a new coach for the wrong reasons. And that's that the coach of this school went elsewhere, is upgrading. And maybe it's a little unfair to claim this school as one of mine because they finished quite strong anyways. But Arizona under Brent Brennan, you lose Jed Fish to Washington, but you finish out the year, and maybe a little surprising, Noah Fafita stays there with you. Look, it's tough to claim this because they were a top 12 team by the end of things. They were probably one of the teams that, along with maybe LSU, teams that would not have wanted to play if the playoffs would have extended. But I just think it's a lot more of the same, despite the unexpected coaching change there. I think Arizona has got the top end talent. We talked about Haynes King, what he can do for Georgia Tech. I think there's a lot of similar stories for Noah Fafita there with Arizona. And so we'll see if they can maintain what they kind of figured out week 5, week 6 a year ago. But, I don't want to linger the point too much because we know where they're coming from. It was a slow start. When they did get it going, though, it really got going, and we'll see if they can maintain that. But only because you might not expect them just because of the head coach change. But I'll throw Arizona in this discussion.
That's an interesting one. I think mostly from the standpoint of a team loses its coach or downgrades at head coach, in my opinion. And
agreed, totally agree.
Unless Noah Fafita just comes in and he's just Superman, which could happen. He could be, and he could really take that next step forward, which would really catapult him into some really pristine company across college football. And I think that would be a lot of fun to see. But at the same time, I have a hard time believing that you downgraded head coach in college football in particular, and then find a way to improve from the year before. I think they're going to be a good team. They're going to be a good team.
Look, they were 10-3 a year ago. So like when I'm saying, for them to match what I would say is a step forward, it's either undefeated or 11-1. And I know I said I wasn't going to look at the schedule, but I'm looking at the schedule. Like, I just don't think 11-1 is out of the question. I mean, you're 2 home games against New Mexico and Northern Arizona. You're at Kansas State, at Utah. You could circle that one. Home versus Texas Tech, at BYU. Home versus Colorado. Home versus West Virginia, at UCF. Home versus Houston, at TCU, and home versus Arizona State in the Territorial Cup. It's just, it really is manageable. I mean, you look at maybe Colorado's improved to the point where they're a problem. Arizona, Utah obviously always proves to be a problem, but like, I don't know. I feel like they should be winning like 11 of these games. So that's all.
I like that. I understand where you're coming from with it, but I just have a hard time believing it. That's all. I mean, just because of where you were last year, if you keep the coach and a lot of the other things stay in place, I think that's a little bit different for me. But you're in a new conference. There's a lot of things that are different. Generally speaking, when a team comes into a conference, they don't come in like a bull in a china shop. That's generally not how it goes. A team that I could expect doing something like that is Oregon. But outside of that, that's probably maybe Texas too. Texas is another one that I think could come in and really upset the apple cart, if you will. But that'll be interesting. And I'm for whatever reason, I find myself rooting for Arizona. I think it's just because of all of the hardships that program's gone through, and they have for a long time been sort of a nothing program. And to go from where they started this year as just a nobody, just from no one expected them to win anything. I don't even know what their over under was, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's sitting at like 3.5 or 4 wins, something in that range. But to go from where they were to what they ended up as a top 12 team in America, a team that was just a half, maybe a 1/2 performance from potentially playing in a Pac-12 championship game. It was just an unbelievable thing, and I find myself rooting for them. But let's keep it over there in the Big 12 for a second. I got 2 teams here, and I'll start with Colorado, a team who I think could be pretty good. They've got a lot of talent, and they got year 2 with Deion Sanders. And I'm not going to sit here. I know you and I, we had plenty of conversations about what Colorado was last year, and there were a lot of let's call them casual fans who jumped into the sport and started talking a little bit about a lot of bit about a little bit, where they talk a lot about things that they don't really know much about. Talking about how Deion Sanders was the best coach in college football, how they're national championship contenders, blah 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 blah. They kind of got taken to the woodshed a little bit, but we look at Shedeur Sanders. We look at a guy who jumped into Power 5 football and played at a really, really high level, and he did that without Travis Hunter for half of the season. They did that without much of a defense at all, a defense that couldn't really stop the run if they wanted to. The offensive line was brutal, but it's year 2 with Deion Sanders. He was able to identify some of those weaknesses. He attacked them in the transfer portal, and that just seems to be his method of madness. And he brings these guys in, and I'm interested, because the Pac-12 was really damn good last year, Abe. The Big 12 this year, I don't think is going to be super good. And FanDuel has their over-under at 5.5. I don't know, man. I think a bowl game is very well within reach, in my opinion. And if you can take that another couple of steps forward, 8 wins, I think you could be a respectable program under Deion Sanders in year 2.
Yeah, the question for Deion, in my opinion, again, this is for 2024, but also just moving forward is to what extent are you developing the players you do have in the program? And that includes the transfer portal guys. Like, how are you making these guys better? Because I don't think any of these guys are quite top tier enough to make massive, massive jumps. They're certainly better than what you had. I totally agree that. And he's done things systematically with a plan to improve certain aspects of his team in year 1. And he took a very detailed plan to improve certain aspects of his program here in year 2. But I also think you've got to develop these guys and continue to get them to improve. And so I'll be looking forward to that. But yeah, I mean, I think where they finished up a year ago was probably what you and I expected from them to an extent. I know it got off to that hot start, if you want to call it that, but we knew what was coming, and it did. I think there's more of the same. Yeah. I don't think this team is immediately jumping to the top of the Big 12, but yeah, I think there's certainly potential for, I mean, look, I will say this, his son Shedeur is a legitimate NFL prospect. He is an elite passer of the ball. There's certainly things he can work on as well. And it would be a great benefit if he had an offensive line that could allow him to work on those things. And so we'll see if that is the case. But if he's protected back there, I think that is a team that can do some damage. I agree with you.
I think they could be. They're at the very least going to be a fun team to watch.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really good thing for all of the casuals, and I kind of like crap on them a little bit at the beginning of that. For all of the annoyances that those folks brought into the sport, they did bring eyeballs, and I think it's kind of like what we're seeing with Caitlin Clark right now at Iowa, with in the way what it's doing to women's college basketball.
She's a winner.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is at the time all of that stuff was happening, Deion Sanders was also winning. Coming off what he did at Jackson State.
You're talking about 2
all
games.
I'm trying to say, eyeballs. The eyeballs came. All right. And sometimes you need a polarizing person like Deion Sanders to come in and really be a lightning rod, and I think it brought a lot of attention to the Pac-12 last year. It brought a lot, and he's going to bring a lot of attention to the Big 12 this year. And I think having him at least in the relevancy of conversation and being brought up, people were interested, because he's an interesting person. And so a piece of me wants Colorado to be at least salvageable this year. Don't just be, I mean, he brought in his Gucci bags, right? But it didn't really do a whole lot of good for the program as a whole. But I think they can build on it and they can do something good with it in 2024. I just think they'd be interesting.
Yeah, you said you had. I have one team left. It's also a Big 12 team. I know you said you had a Big 12 team left.
I got TCU.
Okay, I don't. I don't have
Okay.
TCU.
So
I'm
real
not
quick,
going
this is a
anywhere
quick
near
thought.
that team after what we saw them. Their breakdown after the national championship run.
It's true. It's true. I just think they could be a very interesting team, just a little bit. I mean, Sonny Dykes didn't forget how to coach all of a sudden, but 4 of those games that they lost were decided by 7 points or fewer. And ultimately, when that's the case, you could potentially see a big leap forward because they still have a lot of returning production. They can still be a pretty good football team next year. I don't have a lot of thoughts on TCU just in general, but the final one for me was Auburn. They have a 7.5 win mark. I think year 2, if you freeze, you brought him in to build a program. And look, they've had 3 straight losing seasons for the first time in 5 decades. I don't expect a losing season next year, but I also don't expect a whole lot. I'm not hyper confident with that one just because of the schedule that they have to play. The SEC is going to be brutal in 2024. So it's hard to really think about teams that can take a giant leap forward. You look at Florida, you look at Auburn, you look at a lot of these other teams who I think could be better with younger head coaches, but we're not going to see it in the win-loss column because the teams are going to play. But Auburn, I think you bring in a little revigorated offensive staff. They have a lot of returning production. I think they're going to be a much better football team in 2024. Again, I just don't think that they're going to hit that losing record. 4 losing seasons in a row at Auburn, it's kind of hard to imagine.
Yeah, I'm going to go, like I said, to the Big 12 with Kansas as my last team. This was a program coming into last season that had the preseason player of the year in Jalen Daniels, was the favorite to win the conference, and none of those things happened. They didn't come anywhere close. It was a huge disappointment and step back, that obviously dealing with a lot of injuries for Jalen Daniels. But I really do trust Lance Leipold in terms of building a winner, and I don't think the momentum of the program is gone. I think it was a one year step back due to some circumstances, but I think they'll get back on track this year. Obviously, Texas and Oklahoma leaving helps that argument a little bit in terms of where they rank. Will Howard leaving Kansas State certainly helps out a little bit as well. So I don't know. I just feel like Kansas underachieved the expectations last year. Now, as people lower the expectations, can they overachieve? And that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. And I think that could be very interesting moving into next year. I like that. I like that a lot just because of what Leipold's been able to do with Kansas. And then on top of that, staying at Kansas, a place where he was consistently put on the top of rumored coaches lists. And then he answers by signing an extension at Kansas and really never, as far as we know, interviewing for jobs. I don't know of any off the top of my head. Maybe he did once or twice, but ultimately he is the head coach over there in Kansas. And I think that means good things for that program. So I love that pick right there. But Abe, I do want to get into something with Kirby Smart because Kirby Smart did sit down with Chris Lowe of ESPN, acclaimed college football writer, does a fantastic job. We've talked to him multiple times. And what did you make of these comments? So it's like you go up and down this list, and I sort of read through it a few times, and I mean, he goes into what the team looks like this year, and then I think he's also kind of jumping into that fold of like when something happens in college football, generally people would turn around and ask Nick Saban what he thought, right? And I think Kirby Smart is assuming that role willingly or not, because they started off asking, Chris Lowe did, not questions about Georgia per se. He asked them a lot of questions about the state of college football. He asked him, hey, what do you think about the college football playoff expansion? What are the good things? What are the bad things? What do you make of the calendar? Like little things like that. And it's just sort of his new role in college football. And I know we talked to him at the station, 92.9 The Game at the Steakhouse back when we were in Athens last week. I don't know if he wants to do that necessarily, but he has reached that plateau of the best coach in college football. I don't know what you have to say about that, but ultimately, what did you make of these comments?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's interested in being the voice box for all of college football right now. I think he's still chasing ghosts in terms of ghosts and goats, as it may be. I think he's still got his eyes on a different prize than Nick Saban did at this part last year or in previous years for Saban. There's still a legacy to chase for Kirby Smart, and I think that is his primary focus right now. And if he needs to adjust with how college football is going, I think he's going to, unlike Saban to an extent, who was hoping to adjust college football while also, I don't think they're necessarily on the same path in regards to that. But the thing to me is, I don't know, maybe I look at it as Kirby Smart kind of playing the game a little bit. And what I'm talking about is his comments in regards to quarterback Carson Beck, who is probably as likely to win a Heisman being the quarterback of Georgia as anyone has been. I know Stetson Bennett got the invite, but there was no real threat of him actually winning a Heisman. And I think Kirby Smart is kind of starting up the hype train on behalf of his quarterback by saying, hey, we held Carson Beck back last year. This dude threw for almost 4,000 yards. What was it? 24 touchdowns and 6 picks or whatever the numbers were. And that was with me like putting a limiter on him. We're taking the restrictor plate off and we're going full steam ahead early in the season this year. And I think it's a situation where you're going to see situations that you might see elsewhere that we're not used to seeing at Georgia. I think there's going to be situations where, like, normally Carson Beck should maybe sit the fourth quarter. Maybe he plays one more drive to get one more touchdown, stuff like that. I think there's going to be a little bit of stat padding for Carson Beck this year in games that Georgia can afford it. And I don't blame him for that. I mean, I think Kirby Smart looks at Carson Beck as the best quarterback he's had in his time with Georgia. I mean, in terms of how young he is, in terms of how he's developing into an NFL prospect, the whole package. And so I think it's a situation where he's leading the hype train to start up a Carson for Heisman type of thing. And look, the committee knows, like, Carson Beck is among the betting favorites to win the Heisman already. And I think Kirby, after seeing, and it probably does go back to Stetson Bennett, to be honest, like seeing how Stetson Bennett won, how Stetson Bennett played, and getting no real respect in the eyes of the Heisman, what he meant to that offense, what he meant to those teams for the Georgia Bulldogs. I think maybe it did open up Kirby's eyes, like, hey, if my guys are going to win a Heisman, they got to go 4,500 yards. They got to go 35 touchdowns or maybe more. And so I found that very interesting. You don't always see coaches talk about a player that's active. Like, maybe you would talk about a guy after he's left the program and say, boy, we really held him back early on and maybe we shouldn't have. This is a guy that's in your program. This is a guy that's running your offense. And for you to come out and say, yeah, I held him back last year. I didn't know what he was capable of. I certainly do now. So buckle up. And I know he didn't say it quite like that, but you understand. I think it's really interesting to see that. And again, how much of that just goes into the campaigning for Carson to win a Heisman this year? It's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, look, the University of Georgia hasn't won a Heisman Trophy in 45 years. It's been a long time, and I mean, they've had a couple of opportunities to get guys up to New York for the ceremony. I mean, Garrison Hurst was up there years ago, and Stetson Bennett, like you mentioned, but I don't know if they ever really had somebody who was, was Champ Bailey actually a finalist? I know he was somebody who was he got a lot of votes back in 97. But the point is, this is a program that hasn't had a Heisman Trophy winner in a long time. And I think that would be a feather in the cap of Kirby Smart. That's been something that Nick Saban did for Alabama, because believe it or not, as storied of a program as Alabama was before Nick Saban got there, they had zero Heisman Trophy winners. Mark Ingram changed that. And then, of course, they go on to win multiple Heisman trophies, whether it's Devonta Smith or Derrick Henry, Bryce Young, anybody else. I mean, look, that was a program that was known for creating offensive talent, even though they were known as a defensive school for a very long time. And that's just another thing that he's chasing and trying to create a well-rounded program. Part of that is producing Heisman Trophy winners, and I think that's not necessarily a quote-unquote point of emphasis per se, but I think that would be a really nice feather in the cap of Kirby Smart. So I think that the offense is going to get out and score a lot of points. And based off of some of his comments as well, that's the way it's looking, because he specifically said that Chris Lowe asked him, like, what are the things that have gotten his attention so far this spring? And it's the fact that they may be a little weaker on the defensive line, that or our offensive line is just that good. And it's like, oh boy, that because Georgia's defensive line, I think the biggest thing last year is they didn't have a mauler in the middle. You lose big ol' 88 and Jalen Carter, you're going to take a step back, right? And they didn't really fully replace that, because Bear Alexander, he was supposed to be that guy. He goes out to USC, and look, that offensive line was as good as any in the country, as good as any one that Georgia had produced. And apparently this one coming out this next year is going to be just as good, if not better, than the ones that we've seen over there in Athens. But ultimately, that is what starts a good offense, that and a quarterback. And they've got all of that plus some wide receivers on the outside. Like you said, maybe we're not necessarily starting a Heisman campaign, but I think that Carson Beck is as good as any quarterback in the country. He's going to have as many primetime games as anybody in the country. And he's going to throw for a lot of yards. He's going to stat pad a little bit. Maybe that's what it is. But ultimately, I think Georgia's going to win a lot of football games. I don't think anybody's concerned about that fact. And it looks like they're going to be opening it up a little bit with Mike Bobo in year 2. That's going to be a big deal for Carson Beck and the rest of that offense. And Kirby Smart trusts his offensive coordinator. He trusts his quarterback. And we saw that with Stetson Bennett specifically in his first year. When you have a quarterback that you don't fully trust, that person being Kirby Smart, then they put a cap on you. They did that to Carson Beck. Carson Beck, I don't think we really saw what he's fully capable of until maybe that Ole Miss game, when he really took the top off. And that was in November. And if we see that throughout the course of the full season, he throws for more than 4,000 yards last year. Let me tell you what.
Yeah, I also think it's an interesting situation where losing Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey actually might open up things for your offense, because there's no one to focus on. There's so many more guys that are going to be beating you on a given day. Lovett and Thomas and London Humphreys and Dylan Bell, and not even including Lucky and Dell. I just think when you're not focusing on any one or two guys and forcing certain guys the ball, you do wonder how much that opens up playmaking abilities too. So I know we talk about them losing potentially 2 first-round draft picks, or if McConkey falls into the second round. Well, I meant from the receivers, the playmakers. But I actually wonder how it kind of flattens out the offense to where it might actually be more dangerous to defend, because you're not focusing on just stopping one guy or two guys in a given drive.
I think it's going to be very fun to watch. I mean, if you're in the SEC, man, you're going to be getting a lot of Georgia. Maybe not on CBS, but yeah, that's our first year of having SEC on CBS. That's going to be very interesting. But you'll be seeing them a lot on ESPN in the primetime spot. But ultimately, I think we're in a pretty good situation here in college football. So should make for a very interesting year. But seeing Kirby Smart as almost that figurehead leader of college football, it's an interesting spot.
Let me ask you, is he the only option? Is there someone else that you would discuss as that figure? Just as you think across all of college football, now that he's maybe in the Big Ten, is that something that Lincoln Riley could step into? I mean, because I agree with you, it doesn't feel like Kirby Smart is interested in being the mouthpiece for what's best of college football the way Saban was. Is there anyone else that maybe you think of that is?
Well, you look around not the NFL, excuse me. You look around college football and you look at the best programs. Generally, you're going to look at the best programs, right? Like that's going to be something that you're going to do. That's my first step. And first step is you look at Ohio State. I don't know if Ryan Day's got to take care of his own house first, right? There are rumors that he could be on the hot seat. There are rumors he may not even be the head coach up there in Columbus. I think that's all far-fetched. I think they're going to obliterate Michigan. That's my opinion. But we still got a long way to go before we get to that level. But I don't know if Ryan Day necessarily has that kind of a voice. Dabo Sweeney is somebody who you can look at. He does have that voice, but he hasn't evolved with the sport enough to really be put into that
Yeah, I don't
light.
know. I would say I don't know if they want him speaking for
Mm-mm.
a lot of the coaches. The
I don't know if Steve
interesting,
Sarkisian, I don't know if he's at that level. Lincoln Riley, I don't think is at that level necessarily. I just
I don't know what
I
at that level necessarily means, but an interesting name actually turns out to be Dan Lanning. Because I think he's pretty
mm,
well measured. He's going to be in one of those big conferences. Do you want a guy that hasn't really won anything yet? Being, how much does that play its own role? But
well, but
I
that's what
do
I'm
feel like
saying.
Dan Lanning might be kind of a spiritual successor in terms of protecting the sport to some extent.
But he's also somebody who you see. That's actually a really good pull. That's a really good
Yeah.
pull. He's not there yet. He needs to win more. He needs
Hmm.
to be around longer. And look, he's only been a head coach 2 years, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
I
it's
know.
it's impossible to have him at that level. But to your point, what coaches are you seeing doing media appearances? And I mean,
Yeah.
not Oregon media appearances,
Right.
college football media appearances. That's
Yeah.
Dan Lanning. It's Nick Saban.
Yeah.
You see that happen with some other guys occasionally here and there. You don't necessarily see Kirby Smart doing that. You don't
What
necessarily
about
see that. But Dan
is
Lanning is showing up on College Game Day. He's doing preview shows. He's talking about other programs. He's talking about the sport as a whole. So maybe that is something he could aspire to one day. He's not there yet. Maybe in a couple of years, if he stays at the level he's at right now, then people will look at him with a different lens,
I
probably.
get I got one other name to run by you, and I don't even think I'd be fully behind it, but I'll let you share your opinions. Um, what about Deion Sanders?
I think Deion Sanders talks too loudly to be listened to sometimes. I love a lot of his perspectives because he was a former player. He was a guy who
Hmm.
played in the league for a long time. He's a Hall of
Yeah,
Famer.
and because
He's
got
got a
a
lot of
son in this
swagger, man. I mean, like
position,
that's just what he
though,
is.
you feel like he is a little bit closer tied into what's best for some of these athletes because his sons are in the position currently.
I think it's interesting. I think it's an interesting one. I agree with you that it's may not be necessarily the best one right now.
I think it'd
My
be a
other
much
thing,
tougher sell for Dion to be that guy than for Dan Lanning or
I also
whatever. But
don't
yeah,
think that Deion Sanders is going to stay in college football. Given the
right.
opportunity, he would go to the NFL. I think ultimately, and this isn't a bad thing when I say this, Deion Sanders is most interested in Deion Sanders, you know,
Yeah.
and that's not a bad thing. Like I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing, but I am saying that it's
Even
something
if
to
it is a
consider.
bad thing, it's probably the reality. And I don't think there's anything wrong with speaking the truth.
No, and I don't know how you'd really disagree with the fact necessarily, but the point is, I like that question. I really like that question because it's not about who the best coach is. It's about who is necessarily the best coach for college football, who can be sort of that vocal leader, the guy who can jump up there and say, "Hey, the calendar needs to be updated. Hey, this transfer portal needs to get under control." Um, who's the guy who's going to Capitol Hill alongside of a guy like Nick Saban to speak on behalf of players or give some perspective as to what's going on? And I think that's a very interesting spot. And I think college football lost a really big leader in Nick Saban. That said,
And by the way, that's not to
he's not
say that
gone.
Saban's going
He's
to
not
step
gone.
away from this either. Yeah,
Mm-mm.
exactly.
He still has an office over there in Tuscaloosa. He's still going to be coming to football practices every now and then. He's retired, but retired in quotation marks, Abe. And I think if he wanted to jump in and be like we talk about commissioners of college football on this podcast a few times, he's a guy alongside of a Greg Sankey, a Tony Petiti, like guys like that who could fulfill that role pretty effectively. And I like the idea of Nick Saban having a role in college football still because he is such a respected face and a voice in this sport and on this platform. And I think he would continue to do great things for the sport.
Yeah. What about Lane Kiffin?
No,
Okay, just checking.
no, I don't think he's not respected enough in that sense. And it's not that he's a bad coach to like people respect him on the football field. He he's a little too playful with a lot of different things, and I don't see him in that light necessarily. I love Lane Kiffin. I think he's hilarious. Um, but I also don't think he's interested in it remotely close to being interested in something like that. Um, but there are a lot of people on this list. I mean, James Franklin's a guy who could potentially be
That's an
considered in that
interesting
light, and
one. Yeah.
just because I mean he's coached in the Big Ten,
Yeah.
he's coached in the SEC, he's got a lot
Yeah.
of experience, and his players love him, his coaches respect him, and people flock to him. And he's a voice who's at a big time program too, and he's got a lot of money backing him with a large fan base. And generally speaking, those are a lot of the key indicators of somebody who you would consider in that role. Matt Rule is another.
Nah.
He's just a consistent sort of face, but
Brian Kelly?
probably not. Brian Kelly's an interesting one too. I mean, look, there are a lot of people who can fill this role. And Chip
Well,
Kelly
the problem
is
is
one
there's
who
not.
talks.
The problem is there's probably no one who can fill the role. That's why we're having this discussion
We'll
real
see.
quick.
I think it's a we'll see.
Yeah.
But I like that question. But that'll do it for us here on the College Football Overtime Podcast, episode 42. Episode 42. Well, make sure you're here for episode 43 because we are going to be dropping episodes every single week of the offseason because we're almost to spring games. And then do you know what spring means? Start of the summer. Do you know what the summer means? Football's almost here. So make sure you keep it right here to College Football Overtime. We'll take care of you for the rest of this offseason and beyond. He is Abe Quarter. My name is Garrett Chapman. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, and then make sure you're here this time next week for episode 43 of College Football Overtime. We'll see you then. Thank you.